The sun beat down on Fort Jericho, baking the parade grounds to a dusty ochre crisp. Specialist Elena Ellie Rodriguez, all 5'4" of her, stood ramrod straight in formation, the desert heat a familiar, unwelcome companion. Her olive-drab fatigues, already stained with sweat, felt heavier than usual today, not just from the oppressive weather, but from the invisible weight of the glances she knew were being cast her way. Ellie had joined the army with a fire in her belly, a burning desire to prove herself, not just to the world, but to the ghosts of her own past. Growing up in a small, dusty town in Arizona, a place aptly named Barren Sands, opportunities were as scarce as rain. Her family, hard-working but perpetually struggling, had always instilled in her the value of resilience, of never backing down. But resilience, she was learning, didn't always protect you from the sharp edges of prejudice. From the moment she'd arrived at Fort Jericho, a base notorious for its gruff, old-school mentality, Ellie had felt it. The dismissive nods, the condescending smiles, the thinly veiled jokes about little girls playing soldier. It stung, each barb a tiny wound, but she'd swallowed them down, determined to let her actions speak louder than their words. She'd outrun most of the men on her morning runs, outshot them on the firing range, and her tactical knowledge, honed from hours of study, was second to none. Yet it never seemed enough. Her immediate superior, Sergeant First Class Vance Viper Kincaid, was the primary purveyor of her misery. Kincaid was a hulk of a man, built like a brick wall with a permanent scowl etched onto his weathered face. He'd served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he carried his experience like a heavy shield, deflecting any challenge to his authority, especially from someone he deemed beneath him. And in his eyes, Ellie Rodriguez was most definitely beneath him. "All right, listen up, recruits!" Kincaid's voice, a gravelly rumble, cut through the midday air. "Tomorrow we're doing the desert survival drill. This ain't no walk in the park. This is about separating the wheat from the chaff." His gaze, sharp and humorless, lingered on Ellie for a beat too long. "And some of you," he added, a sneer twisting his lips, "are looking mighty like chaff right about now." A snicker rippled through a small group of soldiers nearby. Private Miller, a stocky young man with a permanent smirk, and Specialist Thompson, who always seemed to echo Miller's sentiments. Ellie clenched her jaw, her knuckles turning white where she gripped her rifle. She could feel her face flush with a mix of anger and humiliation, but she kept her eyes fixed forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. Later that evening, in the cramped barracks she shared with 3 other female soldiers, Ellie meticulously cleaned her rifle. The rhythmic click and whir of the cleaning kit was a soothing balm, a small comfort in the storm of her emotions. "Don't let Kincaid get to you." "Ellie," offered Private First Class Maria Sanchez, a kind-hearted soldier from Texas, as she polished her own boots. "He's just an old dinosaur. He doesn't know what he's talking about." Ellie offered a weak smile. "I know, Maria, but it's hard sometimes, you know? To always feel like you have to fight twice as hard just to be seen as half as good." "Tell me about it," chimed in Sergeant Green, a no-nonsense medic who was the unofficial den mother of their bay. "But you, Ellie, you've got grit. More than most of these boys out here. You'll show them." Ellie appreciated their words, but a knot of unease still tightened in her stomach. Kincaid's words, separating the wheat from the chaff, echoed in her mind. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that this drill was going to be more than just a test of survival skills. It was going to be a personal challenge, orchestrated by Kincaid, designed to push her to her breaking point. The next morning, before the sun had even painted the sky with its first blush of dawn, the platoon gathered, their packs heavy, their faces grim. Kincaid, looking even more imposing in his field gear, addressed them. "This exercise will last 72 hours. You'll be dropped in teams of 2 deep in the Black Rock Desert. Your mission: navigate to a designated rendezvous point using only your wits, a map, and a compass. You'll have minimal rations, enough to keep you from starving, but not enough to make you comfortable. Water will be scarce. The desert is a brutal mistress, and she shows no favoritism. Stay alert, stay together, and don't make stupid mistakes." As the teams were announced, Ellie held her breath. She dreaded being paired with Miller or Thompson, knowing they would only make her life more difficult. When Kincaid finally called her name, her heart pounded. "Specialist Rodriguez," he boomed. "You're with Private Miller." A collective groan, quickly suppressed, rippled through the soldiers. Miller, a smug grin plastered on his face, sauntered over to her, his eyes twinkling with mischievous glee. "Well, well, looks like it's just you and me, little lady," he drawled, his tone dripping with condescension. "Don't worry, I'll protect you out there." Ellie's jaw tightened. "I don't need protecting, Miller," she shot back, her voice low and steady, belying the surge of anger within her. "Just try to keep up." Kincaid, observing the exchange, allowed himself a small, satisfied smirk. This was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to see her fail. He wanted to see her break. He believed that the harsh reality of the desert, combined with the irritation of Miller's presence, would expose her as weak, as unfit for military life. He'd seen plenty of soldiers like her come and go, full of bravado, only to crumble under pressure. He was convinced Ellie would be no different. The Black Rock Desert was a vast, unforgiving expanse of rock, sand, and scrub brush. The air, even in the early morning, was already thick with the promise of scorching heat. The sun, a relentless eye in the pale sky, began its slow, inevitable ascent, turning the already harsh landscape into a shimmering, heat-drenched inferno. Ellie and Miller were dropped by a military transport helicopter, its rotors kicking up a swirling vortex of dust and pebbles before it disappeared into the hazy horizon, leaving them alone in the vast, silent wilderness. The silence after the roar of the helicopter was deafening, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gravelly ground and the distant cry of a hawk. Miller immediately started complaining. "Man, this sucks. Why do we always get the crappiest assignments?" He squinted at the map, holding it upside down. "So where are we supposed to go?" Ellie, who had already oriented herself and was consulting her compass, sighed inwardly. This was going to be a long 72 hours. "We're here," she said, pointing to a spot on the map. "And our rendezvous point is here." She traced a path with her finger. "We need to head northwest, aiming for that ridge line." Miller scoffed. "You think you know everything, don't you, Rodriguez? Why don't you let a real man lead the way?" He grabbed the map from her, fumbling with it for a moment before declaring, "I say we go this way, shorter." He pointed in a completely different direction, towards a seemingly endless expanse of flat, featureless desert. Ellie's patience, already thin, frayed a little more. "Miller, that's not the right way. That's going to lead us further into the open desert, away from any cover or potential water sources. We need to stick to the planned route." "Planned route, schmon planned route," he muttered, already striking off in his chosen direction. "I got this." Ellie hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to argue, to force him to see reason. But she also knew that direct confrontation with Miller often led to him digging in his heels even harder. And out here in this desolate landscape, discord could be deadly. She also knew that in a survival situation, going off alone was even more dangerous. With a heavy heart, she followed him, her mind already calculating the extra time and effort they would have to expend to correct his inevitable mistake. As the hours dragged on, the sun climbed higher, relentless and unforgiving. The heat became a physical presence, pressing down on them, draining their energy. Miller's initial bravado slowly began to wane, replaced by a sullen silence and increasing signs of fatigue. He sweated profusely, his face turning a dangerous shade of red, and he frequently stumbled over loose rocks. Ellie, despite her own discomfort, felt a grim satisfaction in her superior conditioning. She had trained harder than anyone, pushing her body to its limits, and now it was paying off. She conserved her water meticulously, taking small, measured sips, while Miller gulped his down in large, desperate swigs. By mid-afternoon, Miller was clearly struggling. His pace slowed to a crawl, and he started complaining about thirst more frequently. "I'm telling you, Rodriguez, we should have brought more water. This is ridiculous." "We were issued standard rations, Miller," Ellie replied, her voice firm. "You just haven't been conserving yours." She pointed to a faint shimmer in the distance. "There's a dry riverbed about a mile ahead. We can use it for shade and rest for a bit." Miller grumbled, but followed. When they finally reached the gully, a shallow depression in the earth with a few scraggly bushes offering meager shade, he collapsed onto the sand, gasping for breath. Ellie, though tired, remained on her feet, scanning the horizon, her mind already planning their next move. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, the temperature mercifully dropped, but the exhaustion remained. They found a sheltered spot to set up their temporary camp for the night. The sun, a malevolent eye, climbed higher, its rays intensifying with each passing minute. The desert, which had seemed merely harsh the day before, now felt actively hostile. The loss of their water, the last visible link to survival, was a punch to the gut for both Ellie and Miller. Miller, now slumped against a boulder, looked utterly defeated, his face pale beneath the grime and sweat. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a hollow despair. Ellie, however, found a strange, cold clarity in the face of disaster. Fear was a familiar companion, but she refused to let it paralyze her. Her training kicked in, a methodical process of assessment and planning. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. "All right, Miller, get up," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the suffocating silence. "Wallowing isn't going to get us anywhere." He looked at her with dull, lifeless eyes. "What's the point, Rodriguez? We're done. No water. We're gonna die out here." "Not on my watch," Ellie shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. "We still have options. We don't have time for a pity party. We need to move. Now!" She pulled out her map, her finger tracing the contours of the land. "We're still about a day's walk from the rendezvous point, maybe more without water. Our best bet is to find a wadi, a dry riverbed, and hope there's an underground spring or at least some damp earth we can dig for." Miller slowly pushed himself to his feet, his movements sluggish. "You really think we'll find anything?" he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "I don't think, Miller. I know we have to try," Ellie replied, already starting to pack their meager supplies. "We have our emergency rations. They'll help keep us going for a bit, but water is critical." They began to walk, but the dynamic between them had shifted dramatically. Miller, stripped of his bravado, now relied on Ellie completely. He followed her lead, his eyes rarely leaving her back, a silent testament to his newfound respect, or perhaps just his desperate need for guidance. The hours crawled by. The landscape was a blur of monotonous sand and rock, broken only by the occasional resilient cactus. The heat was a constant oppressive weight, stealing their breath and clouding their thoughts. Ellie found herself mentally running through every survival lesson she'd ever learned. Conserve energy, avoid direct sunlight, keep moving. Each step was an effort, a conscious act of will. Her throat felt like sandpaper, her lips cracked and dry. By late afternoon, the first signs of serious dehydration began to manifest. Miller stumbled more frequently, his coordination faltering. His eyes were bloodshot and he complained of dizziness. Ellie, though also suffering, pushed through the discomfort, fueled by an inner resolve that surprised even herself. She kept her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, searching for any sign of a dip in the land, a hint of a wadi. "Ellie," Miller rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I can't go on." He collapsed again, this time with a thud, his body trembling. Ellie knelt beside him, her heart sinking. His skin was hot and dry to the touch, and his breathing was shallow. He was clearly in distress. She knew they couldn't afford to stop, not out here. But she also knew she couldn't leave him. "Come on, Miller," she urged, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just a little further. We'll rest when we find some shade, I promise." She tried to help him up, but he was a dead weight. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor. But the heat lingered, trapped by the rocks and sand. This was the most dangerous time, the precious hours before nightfall, when finding shelter and making progress were critical. With immense effort, Ellie managed to get Miller to lean on her, his arm slung over her shoulder. His full weight pressed down on her, testing her already strained muscles, but she gritted her teeth and pushed forward, one agonizing step after another. Her mind was a kaleidoscope of images. Her family back in barren sands, their faces etched with pride when she told them she was joining the army. Sergeant Kincaid's sneer, the burning desire to prove them all wrong. She would not fail. She could not fail. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, Ellie spotted it, a barely perceptible depression in the land winding its way through the barren landscape. A wadi. Her heart leaped with a flicker of hope. "Miller," she whispered, pointing with her free hand. "Look, a wadi! We're almost there!" He mumbled something incoherent, his head lolling against her shoulder. She knew he was fading fast. Drawing on a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed, she half-carried, half-dragged him towards the dry riverbed. They finally reached it. A shallow, sandy trench, offering precious little shade, but it was better than nothing. Ellie gently lowered Miller to the ground, his breathing now ragged and shallow. She immediately began to dig, using her entrenching tool, then her bare hands, scraping away at the dry, dusty earth. Hope, fragile but persistent, propelled her. She dug until her muscles screamed in protest, until her hands were raw and bleeding, until the first faint hint of moisture appeared in the sand. It wasn't much, just a dampness, but it was a sign. She continued to dig, widening the shallow pit until a small pool of muddy water began to seep up from the earth. It was brackish, barely potable, but it was water. Carefully, she scooped some into her canteen, letting the sediment settle before offering it to Miller. "Here," she whispered, holding it to his cracked lips. Just a little, slowly. He took a weak sip, then another, his eyes fluttering open slightly. The water, though dirty, seemed to revive him, bringing a faint flicker of life back to his face. Ellie watched him, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She drank some herself, the taste metallic and earthy, but gloriously refreshing. They rested in the wadi, huddled together for warmth as the desert night grew cold. Miller, slowly regaining his senses, looked at Ellie with a mixture of awe and shame.
You
saved my life, Rodriguez," he rasped, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "I'm sorry for everything I said, for everything I did." Ellie simply nodded, too tired to respond. The apology, though heartfelt, felt secondary to the sheer exhaustion of their ordeal. All that mattered was that they were still alive. The next morning, though still weak, Miller was much improved. The water had done its work, and a faint glimmer of his usual self had returned, albeit a much chastened version. The near-death experience had humbled him, stripping away his arrogance and revealing a vulnerability he rarely showed. They continued their journey, following the wadi, hoping it would eventually lead them to a more substantial water source or closer to their rendezvous point. The landscape, though still harsh, seemed less threatening now that they had found water. Ellie's navigational skills, combined with Miller's newfound willingness to cooperate, made their progress more efficient. But the desert had one more cruel trick up its sleeve. As they rounded a bend in the wadi, they heard it, a low, rumbling growl that sent shivers down their spines. A large, gaunt coyote, its fur matted and its eyes gleaming with hunger, stood blocking their path. It was larger than any coyote Ellie had ever seen, and it looked dangerously desperate. "Stay calm, Miller," Ellie whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife she carried on her belt. "Don't make any sudden movements." The coyote, its lips curled back in a snarl, took a tentative step forward. Its gaze was fixed on them, two vulnerable figures, perhaps an easy meal. Miller, despite his earlier bravery, visibly tensed, his eyes wide with fear. Ellie knew they were in a precarious situation. They were weakened by dehydration and fatigue, and the coyote was clearly aggressive. Her mind raced, calculating their options. They couldn't outrun it. They couldn't afford a prolonged fight that would further deplete their energy. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Ellie lunged forward, not at the coyote but at a cluster of loose rocks nearby. She grabbed a fist-sized stone and hurled it with all her might, aiming not to hit the animal, but to create a loud, startling noise. The rock whizzed past the coyote's head, smashing into the wadi wall with a sharp crack. The coyote, startled by the unexpected aggression, recoiled, its predatory focus momentarily broken. Ellie seized the opportunity. She let out a fierce, guttural yell, a primal sound of defiance that echoed through the wadi. Miller, understanding her intent, joined in, his voice surprisingly strong despite his earlier weakness. The combined assault of noise and sudden movement was enough. The coyote, confused and wary, hesitated for a moment, then turned and loped away, disappearing around the bend. Ellie and Miller stood panting, their hearts hammering in their chests. The danger had passed, but the encounter had left them shaken. It was a stark reminder of the unforgiving nature of the desert, where every living creature was locked in a constant struggle for survival. "Well," Miller said, a shaky laugh escaping his lips. "I guess that's one way to scare off a dog." Ellie managed a weak smile. "Just another day in paradise, right?" They continued on, their resolve strengthened by the shared ordeal. The sun was now high in the sky, and the heat was once again unbearable. Their water supply, though replenished, was still precious. They moved with a newfound understanding of their interdependence, a silent acknowledgement of the trust that had been forged in the crucible of fear and survival. As the day wore on, Ellie, despite her weariness, felt a strange sense of purpose. She wasn't just surviving for herself anymore. The third day dawned, bringing with it a sense of urgent desperation. Their emergency rations were dwindling, and while they had managed to find enough muddy water to survive, their bodies were screaming for real sustenance. The constant heat and the relentless physical exertion had taken their toll. Ellie and Miller moved with the weary precision of seasoned desert travelers, their initial antagonism replaced by a grim, unspoken understanding. Miller, who had once mocked her every move, now deferred to her judgment without question. He rarely spoke, but his glances, though still laced with exhaustion, held a genuine respect she hadn't seen before. He even tried to lighten their load by taking a heavier share of their remaining gear, a silent act of penance for his earlier foolishness. "We should be getting close to the coordinates," Ellie rasped, consulting her map for the 100th time. Her voice was hoarse, her throat dry, but her mind remained sharp, focused on the mission. "If my calculations are right, we should reach the rendezvous point by late afternoon." A faint glimmer of hope sparked in Miller's eyes. "Thank God. I could really use a hot meal and a soft bed right about now." They pressed on, their spirits buoyed by the prospect of rescue. The landscape began to change subtly, the endless stretches of sand giving way to more rocky outcrops and the occasional hardy scrub tree. Ellie kept her eyes peeled for any sign of human activity, any indication that they were nearing civilization, or at least their extraction point. Suddenly, Miller stopped dead in his tracks, his hand shooting out to grab Ellie's arm. "Ellie, look," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of alarm and disbelief. Ellie followed his gaze. In the distance, partially obscured by a cluster of boulders, was a military Humvee, its camouflage blending almost perfectly with the desert terrain. Her heart leaped. "Rescue!" But something felt wrong. The Humvee was stationary, and there was no sign of anyone around it. A wave of unease washed over her. "Stay low," she instructed Miller, her voice barely audible. "Something's not right." They crept closer, using the sparse cover of the rocks and bushes. As they drew nearer, the scene that unfolded before them sent a cold shiver down Ellie's spine. The Humvee was not empty. Two figures dressed in military fatigues were huddled beside it, their backs to Ellie and Miller. But they weren't sending out distress signals or preparing for extraction. They were talking, their voices low, urgent, and punctuated by hushed laughter. Ellie recognized one of the figures instantly. Sergeant First Class Vance Kincaid. Her blood ran cold. The other figure was Lieutenant Henderson, Kincaid's close confidant and second in command. They were supposed to be at the main base, waiting for the teams to return. What were they doing out here, alone, so far from the designated rendezvous point? Ellie and Miller exchanged a bewildered glance. They instinctively hunkered down, straining to hear snippets of the conversation. The wind, a mischievous accomplice, carried their words faintly, fragments of a disturbing puzzle. "Figured Rodriguez would be the first to break," Kincaid's gravelly voice rumbled, a triumphant note in his tone. "That little punk should have known she wouldn't last," Lieutenant Henderson chuckled. "You really showed her, Sarge. Left her high and dry, just like you said you would. No water, miles from anywhere. She'll be begging for a chopper by now, if she's even still conscious. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Her blood ran cold. Left her high and dry, no water? The words echoed in her mind, chilling her to the bone. It wasn't an accident that their water had gone missing. It wasn't Kincaid's random decision to pair her with Miller. It was deliberate. A setup. Miller, hearing the same words, let out a choked gasp of outrage. His earlier fear was instantly replaced by a furious indignation. His eyes, wide with disbelief, met Ellie's. The truth, ugly and undeniable, settled between them like a toxic cloud. "They sabotaged us," Miller whispered, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "Kincaid, he set us up." Ellie felt a surge of white-hot anger, quickly followed by a cold, calculating resolve. She had always known Kincaid disliked her, but to intentionally put her life in danger, to leave her to die in the desert, that was a betrayal of the highest order. A despicable act that went against every principle of military conduct. And it wasn't just her. Miller, too, had been a casualty of Kincaid's malice, an unwitting pawn in his cruel game. They listened, hidden amongst the rocks, as Kincaid and Henderson continued their callous conversation. "Just makes things easier, right?" Henderson said, a smirk in his voice. "One less problem to deal with. And who's going to question it? Just another rookie who couldn't hack it in the desert." Kincaid grunted in agreement. "Exactly. We'll wait a few more hours, then head back. Report that their team never showed up at the rendezvous. Lost in the desert, we'll say. Happens all the time." The casual cruelty in their voices, the utter disregard for human life, was sickening. Ellie's stomach churned. This wasn't just about disrespect anymore. This was about murder, and they were just moments away from walking right into their trap. A new plan, grim and urgent, began to form in Ellie's mind. They couldn't simply go to the rendezvous point now. Kincaid would undoubtedly try to finish what he started, or at the very least, ensure they never got a chance to speak. They had to be smart. They had to expose him. She slowly, carefully, began to back away, motioning for Miller to follow. Their footsteps were silent, barely disturbing the sand. They retreated until they were out of earshot, then found a more secluded spot behind a large rock formation. "We can't go to the rendezvous point," Ellie stated, her voice low and steady, belying the storm of emotions raging within her. "He'll be waiting, and he won't hesitate to silence us for good." Miller's face was a mask of furious determination. "So what do we do, Ellie? We can't just let him get away with this. He tried to kill us. We need proof," Ellie said, her mind racing. "And we need to get back to base. But not through the normal channels. We need to go somewhere they won't expect us, somewhere we can get help without Kincaid or Henderson finding out." She pulled out her map again, her eyes scanning the familiar contours of the base. Fort Jericho was a sprawling complex with multiple entry points. She knew the layout intimately, having studied it during her training. There was a seldom-used service entrance on the far side of the base, primarily for supply deliveries, usually unmanned after hours. It was a long shot, but it was their best option. "It's going to be a long walk, Miller," Ellie said, pointing to the furthest edge of the map, far from the main gates. "Probably another 2 days, maybe more, especially if we have to move stealthily. And we'll have to avoid any patrols Kincaid might send out looking for us." Miller nodded, his jaw set. "I'll follow your lead, Ellie. Whatever it takes." The cocky, arrogant private was gone, replaced by a resolute soldier fueled by a righteous anger. The desert, in its brutal fairness, had forged a new bond between them, a bond tempered by shared hardship and common enemy. They began their arduous journey, not towards the rendezvous point but away from it, deeper into the lesser-known parts of the desert, aiming for the obscure service entrance of Fort Jericho. They moved cautiously, constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of vehicles or patrols. The sun beat down on them, but now a new kind of fire burned within Ellie. The fire of injustice, of a sacred trust betrayed. The next 2 days were a blur of pain, exhaustion, and simmering fury. They rationed their remaining food and water with extreme care. Ellie navigated with unwavering precision, her internal compass guiding them through the maze of canyons and rock formations. Miller, though clearly struggling, pushed himself to his limits, his eyes fixed on Ellie's back, a silent testament to his newfound respect and unwavering loyalty. They dodged a small patrol Humvee once, pressing themselves flat against the heated rock face, holding their breath until the vehicle rumbled past, oblivious to their presence. The close call only heightened their sense of urgency and danger. Kincaid, Ellie knew, would be growing increasingly suspicious if they didn't turn up. He might even be sending out search parties not to rescue them, but to ensure their permanent disappearance. By the second night, they were mere miles from the outskirts of Fort Jericho. The lights of the base, a distant, shimmering glow against the dark horizon, were a beacon of hope. But they also represented the potential for discovery. They needed to be careful, meticulous in their approach. As they crept closer, using the cover of darkness, Ellie's mind replayed Kincaid's words. Left her high and dry. The sheer audacity, the chilling disregard for their lives fueled her. She wouldn't just survive. She would expose him. She would make him pay for his treachery. They finally reached the perimeter fence near the service entrance. It was less guarded than the main gates, but still presented a formidable obstacle. The fence was tall, topped with barbed wire, and the ground around it was littered with surveillance sensors. "How are we going to get in?" Miller whispered, his voice laced with renewed anxiety. Ellie, ever resourceful, had already spotted a potential weakness. A section of the fence, near a thick cluster of desert brush, appeared to have a slight sag, perhaps from an earlier repair or heavy equipment passing through. It wouldn't be easy, but it was doable. "We go over," she said, her eyes fixed on the fence. "Carefully." Sergeant Green was a force of nature when roused. Her initial shock quickly gave way to a steely determination. She immediately understood the gravity of the situation, not just for Ellie and Miller, but for the integrity of Fort Jericho and the trust placed in its leadership. This wasn't just a grievance. It was a military crime of the highest order. "You two are in no condition to be running around," Green declared, her voice firm. "First, we get you cleaned up and fed. Then we document everything, every detail, every insult, every turn. We're going straight to Colonel Davies." Colonel Davies was the commanding officer of Fort Jericho, a stern but fair man known for his unwavering commitment to justice and discipline. He was also Kincaid's direct superior. Approaching him directly, bypassing the usual chain of command, was a bold move, but Green knew it was necessary. Any attempt to go through lower ranks would undoubtedly be intercepted and buried by Kincaid's cronies. Ellie and Miller, despite their exhaustion, felt a surge of adrenaline. The fight wasn't over, but now they had an ally, a powerful one. As Green administered first aid, cleaned their wounds, and provided them with hot food and fresh water, Ellie meticulously recounted the entire ordeal, from Kincaid's initial sneers to the harrowing moments in the wadi, and finally to the overheard conversation by the Humvee. Miller filled in the gaps, his voice still hoarse but filled with conviction. Green listened, taking copious notes, her face a grim mask. When they were finished, she looked at them, her eyes blazing with resolve. "This is going to be a tough fight, kids. Kincaid is well connected. He'll deny everything. He'll try to discredit you, but we have the truth on our side, and we have each other." The next morning, after a few hours of much-needed rest, Ellie and Miller, still looking battered but resolute, accompanied Sergeant Green to Colonel Davies's office. The air in the headquarters building was tense. Whispers about Kincaid's missing team had already begun to circulate, tinged with Kincaid's own carefully planted narrative of lost rookies. Colonel Davies was a formidable presence, seated behind his large, polished desk. His gaze, sharp and penetrating, swept over Ellie and Miller, lingering on their scraped faces and torn uniforms. He listened in silence as Green, in a clear, concise voice, laid out their story, presenting the evidence they had managed to gather. The map with the altered route, the timeline of their water consumption versus Miller's, and most damningly, the detailed account of Kincaid and Henderson's conversation. As Green spoke, Ellie watched Colonel Davies's face. His expression remained unreadable, but his jaw gradually tightened and a muscle twitched in his cheek. When Green finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Sergeant First Class Kincaid has already reported that Specialist Rodriguez and Private Miller failed to meet their rendezvous point, Colonel Davies said, his voice low and even, betraying no emotion. He stated that they were likely disoriented and lost their way, a common occurrence for inexperienced soldiers. He paused, his gaze fixed on Ellie. Are you telling me, Specialist, that this was not merely an accident of navigation, but a deliberate act of sabotage? Yes, sir, Ellie replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Sergeant First Class Kincaid intentionally gave us a false route, knowing it would lead us into a more dangerous part of the desert. He then removed our emergency water cache, and we overheard him and Lieutenant Henderson discussing their plan to leave us to die, sir, and report us as lost. Miller, stepping forward, added, Sir, he called us chaff and said he'd show her she couldn't hack it. He wanted her out. He used me to make sure she'd fail, sir. Colonel Davies leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed. These are incredibly serious accusations, Specialist. Accusations of dereliction of duty, endangerment of soldiers, and potentially attempted murder. We understand that, sir, Ellie said, meeting his gaze directly. But we have no reason to lie. We almost died out there because of him. We barely made it back. Colonel Davies stood up and walked to the window, his back to them. He stared out at the parade grounds, silent for a long moment. Ellie held her breath, her heart pounding. This was it. Their fate, Kincaid's fate, hung in the balance. Finally, he turned, his face stern. Sergeant Green confined Sergeant First Class Kincaid and Lieutenant Henderson to their quarters, pending a full investigation. Their weapons and communications devices are to be confiscated immediately. A collective sigh of relief escaped Ellie, Miller, and Green. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Colonel Davies was taking them seriously. Specialist Rodriguez, Private Miller, he continued, his gaze softening slightly as he looked at them. You are to be medically evaluated and given whatever time you need to recover. You are also to prepare to give full statements to the investigating officers. This will not be easy. Kincaid has friends, but I promise you, I will get to the bottom of this. The next few days were a whirlwind of medical examinations, debriefings, and interviews. Ellie and Miller gave their statements repeatedly, each time solidifying their story, adding more details, presenting a united front. The investigating officers, initially skeptical, began to see the holes in Kincaid's carefully constructed narrative. His story of lost rookies didn't account for Ellie's renowned navigational skills, nor did it explain the missing emergency water cache, which Kincaid had conveniently forgotten to mention in his initial report. Word of the unfolding investigation spread like wildfire through Fort Jericho. The whispers turned into open discussion, the initial disbelief slowly giving way to shock and anger. Kincaid's supporters, initially vocal, began to recede into the shadows as the evidence mounted. His reputation, once unassailable, began to unravel. Other soldiers, emboldened by Ellie and Miller's courage, started coming forward with their own stories of Kincaid's abuses, his favoritism, his bullying, his thinly veiled misogyny towards female soldiers. It turned out Ellie wasn't his first victim, just the one who survived and spoke up. The weight of the impending court-martial bore down on Kincaid and Henderson. Confined to their quarters, stripped of their authority, they watched as their world crumbled around them. Kincaid, a man who thrived on power and control, began to crack under the pressure. One evening, a week after their return, Ellie received a summons to Colonel Davies' office. She found him sitting there, a grim expression on his face, a stack of papers on his desk. Specialist Rodriguez, he began. Sergeant First Class Kincaid has confessed. Ellie felt a jolt of shock, then a wave of profound relief. He confessed, sir? Yes, Colonel Davies confirmed. The evidence was overwhelming, and Lieutenant Henderson, facing a full court-martial, provided a detailed testimony against Kincaid, confirming every aspect of your story. Kincaid admitted to deliberately tampering with your navigation, to removing your water, and to intending for you to get lost and perish in the desert. His motive, he stated, was to send a message about female soldiers and to remove what he perceived as a distraction from his unit. A cold, hard satisfaction settled in Ellie's chest. Justice! It was real! Both Kincaid and Henderson will face severe charges, Colonel Davies continued. They will be dishonorably discharged and will face a military court-martial for multiple offenses, including endangerment of military personnel and conduct unbecoming an officer. Their military careers and their lives as they knew them are over. He looked at Ellie, his expression softening into one of profound respect. Specialist Rodriguez, you showed extraordinary courage, resilience, and leadership under the most extreme circumstances. Not only did you survive, but you brought to light a grave injustice that could have had even more tragic consequences. You are an exemplary soldier, a credit to this uniform, and an inspiration to us all. Ellie, usually stoic, felt a lump form in her throat. The validation, coming from Colonel Davies, was more meaningful than any promotion or commendation. It was an acknowledgement of her worth, not just as a soldier, but as a human being. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "No, specialist," Colonel Davies corrected, a rare smile gracing his lips. "Thank you. You redefined survival, not just for yourselves, but for the entire spirit of this base. You refused to be a victim. You fought back, and in doing so, you exposed a rot that needed to be cut out." As she walked out of Colonel Davies' office, the sun, which had once felt like a tormentor, now warmed her face like a gentle caress. The whispers of Fort Jericho were no longer about her perceived weakness, but about her undeniable strength. The scorn had turned into respect, the injustice into justice, and Ellie, the young woman who had once been left to die in the desert, now walked tall, a symbol of unwavering resilience and the quiet power of truth. Her journey, she knew, was far from over, but the path ahead was finally clear, paved not with the shifting sands of doubt, but with the solid ground of earned respect. Part 5. Redemption and a New Dawn. The aftermath of Kincaid's exposure rippled through Fort Jericho like a seismic shockwave. The court-martial was swift and uncompromising. Kincaid, stripped of his rank and dignity, was sentenced to a substantial prison term for his crimes, followed by a dishonorable discharge. Henderson, who cooperated with the investigation, received a lesser sentence, but also faced a dishonorable discharge.